The Horus Heresy, also known as the Age of Darkness, was the first and most devastating civil war in Imperial history. Occurring in early M31 and lasting several years, it divided and nearly destroyed the fledgling Imperium. It marked the end of the Great Crusade and the encasing of the Emperor of Mankind into the Golden Throne. Preliminary causes. Though the heresy was ignited by the product of a conspiracy by the forces of chaos, there were precipitating factors that helped push many of the Legio Astartes towards rebellion. The first was the Emperor's return to and seclusion on Terra, working on a secret project that he refused to share with any of his primarchs, including his most favored son Horus, whom he had named War Master. This apparent abandonment of the Great Crusade, for something he would not even share with his sons, bred mistrust, resentment, and disappointment towards the Emperor amongst many of the primarchs. Another contributing factor was the formation of an administrative body known as the Council of Terra. Many of the primarchs viewed these human bureaucrats as usurping their rightful place as rulers of the Imperium they had fought so hard to create. Worse still, the primarchs were denied a place on the council, and the notion of an Imperium dominated by human bureaucrats, not the sons of the Emperor and their Astartes legions, became a cause of concern for many of the primarchs. In addition, the Emperor's disciplining of Lorga and the word-bearers was a contributing factor to the heresy and the event which set it directly into motion. After Lorga and the entire legion were publicly humiliated, scolded, and forced to kneel in front of the Emperor for spreading their belief that the ruler of mankind was a divine being, the pious word-bearers felt betrayed and desperately sought any power in the universe to worship. This eventually led Lorga and his legionaries to the Eye of Terror, where they pledged themselves to the forces of chaos and began to conspire against the Emperor. Thus the word-bearers had secretly become the first Chaos Space Marines. Secretly planning to make war on the Emperor, the word-bearers quietly established warrior lodges with their chaplains throughout the rest of the Astartes legions. Though harmless at first glance, many of these lodges would become hotbeds of support for Horus rebellion in the war to come. According to First Lord of the Imperium, Malcador the Sigillite, the heresy's causes may have been deliberately put into motion by both himself and the Emperor. According to Malcador, they both deliberately agitated the primarchs and turned them against one another, with the resulting war purging certain unmanageable primarchs and their respective Space Marine legions, just as they had the earlier Thunder Warriors. This would lead humanity, not bioengineered superhumans, as the rulers of the galaxy. However, the ruinous powers intervened before their plan could be fully formulated, leading to disaster in the Horus Heresy. This account may be either a partial or total lie, as Malcador himself seems to keep its validity ambiguous. Horus's corruption. However, the Horus Heresy truly began after War Master Horus was wounded by the possessed Eugen Temba, wielding the stolen anatheme on the moon of Davin, a place that was cursed by the foul chaos god Nurgle. The wound caused by the blade refused to heal, despite Horus's super-enhanced immune system or the efforts of the sons of Horus's best apothecaries. The Mournival took Horus to the Davinite Serpent Lodge, which they were told could heal him. Erebus and the word-bearers had orchestrated the battle on Davin, unknown to all involved. During the rituals, Horus's spirit was transferred into the warp, where Erebus, disguised as the War Master's closest friend, Hasta Sejanus, showed him a terrible vision of the very future which his actions would bring about, the Imperium as a repressive, violent, and superstitious regime where the Emperor and some of the primarchs, but not Horus, were worshipped as divine beings by the fanatical and ignorant masses of humanity. The Chaos Gods portrayed themselves as the victims of the Emperor's psychic might, who had no interest themselves in controlling the material world. Horus had already grown jealous and deeply resentful of his perceived poor treatment at the hands of his father, the Emperor. He was one of many who were afraid of the concept of a peace where all that they had fought for was given to weak-willed men, whilst his legions were cast aside and left as peacekeepers. Horus therefore proved all too willing to accept the ruinous powers' false visions of an emperor determined to make himself a god at Horus's expense. But there was one thing no one had counted on: Horus's brother, Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, had continued to study the forbidden arts of sorcery, and was not about to let his brother fall to the powers of the warp. The Cyclopean giant appeared within Horus's vision, revealing the chaplain's identity and begging Horus not to give in to the temptations of chaos. Unfortunately, Horus had decided that if anyone deserved to be worshipped as a god, it was he, and not the Emperor. He accepted the offer of the Chaos Gods to join their cause, and in return they healed his wound and granted him the powers of the warp. The Chaos Gods' pact with Horus was simple: give us the Emperor and we will give you the galaxy. Swaying the legions. Renouncing his oath to the Emperor, Horus led his legion into worship of the myriad Chaos Gods. Horus's genius was revealed as he converted half of the legions, along with many regiments of the Imperial army, and several Titan legions to his cause, revealing the Emperor to be as Horus saw him, a man undeserving of the praise and recognition of the human race. Angron of the World Eaters, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, and Murterion of the Death Guard were the first Primarchs to side with the War Master. Horus found it easy to exploit the Primarch's flaws. Angron's frenzied love of violence was a match for Khorne. Fulgrim was corrupted by a demon weapon of Slaanesh, and its promise of unending perfection. Murterion, already a close friend of his brother, was also easily persuaded, having been turned long before the heresy, through the efforts of his first captain, Callus Typhon. Erebus had already vouched for the support of Lorga and the Word-Bearers, and Horus's plans came together with these legions at his side. Of the other eventual traitors, Conrad Kurz was due to face disciplinary action from the Emperor for his excessive bloodshed on Nostramo. Alfarius chose to join Horus after an ancient cabal of aliens revealed a prophecy to him that Horus's victory would cause the downfall of the Chaos powers. Perturbo's cold nature and bitterness towards Rogel Dorn made him an easy target for corruption. Even with so many legions on his side, Horus was still aware that some of his brothers would never join him. 3 of the most loyal Primarchs, Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, and Rupert Gilliman of the Ultramarines, were sent on missions far from Terra. The Blood Angels were sent to the demon-infested Cygnus Cluster and the Ultramarines to Calth, where Cor Farron later attacked the Loyalists with a large force of Word-Bearers and millions of Chaos cultists. Unbeknownst to the Lion, a rebellion was soon to occur on his homeworld of Caliban, while the bulk of his legion was bogged down battling the Gordian League. The Imperial Fists and White Scars were too close to Terra to be contacted without raising suspicion, though Horus mistakenly believed that Jagatai Khan would ultimately take his side. Shortly before the Drop Site massacre, Horus also ordered Fulgrim to turn Ferrus Manus to their cause, but the Phoenix underestimated the Gorgon's loyalty and barely escaped alive. Fulgrim promised he would deliver Manus' head to Horus in recompense. The remaining legions, the Raven Guard, Salamanders, Iron Hands, and Space Wolves, remained staunchly loyal to the Emperor, though all but the Wolves would pay dearly for it in the battles to come. Beyond the legions, Horus had already swayed Adept Regulus with promises of the standard template constructs recovered during the war with the Oretian technocracy, delivering Adeptus Mechanicus support to the War Master's forces, and had corrupted a large portion of the Imperial army and navy. Burning of Prospero. Magnus, however, had yet to be dealt with. The Primarch was aware of his brother's fall and attempted to warn the Emperor of the impending betrayal. However, knowing that he would have to find a means of quickly warning the Emperor, Magnus decided to use his sorcery to deliver the message as an act of both desperation and vindication. The message penetrated the psychic defenses of the Imperial Palace on Terra, shattering all the psychic wards the Emperor had placed on the palace and destroying his secret project, a physical gate by which the Emperor intended to invade the Webway and take battle to the Eldar. Magnus's brute force assault on the wards allowed the Warp and its myriad inhabitants to invade Terra. In the City of Sight, the tremendous rush of raw psychic energy obliterated the Choir Primus and shattered nearly every Whisper Stone. Millions died as their minds were burned out or demons tore them apart. Warp storms consumed entire settlements. Shockwaves flattened structures around the world. Having already outlawed the Primarch's use of sorcery and refusing to believe that Horus, his most beloved and trusted son, would betray him, the Emperor instead perceived the traitor to be Magnus and his legion. The Emperor ordered the Primarch, Leman Russ, to mobilize his Space Wolves Legion and take Magnus into custody. Horus, however, persuaded Russ that Magnus was a threat and should not return to Terra alive. The Wolves of Fenris descended upon Prospero, destroying all in their path. Magnus, betrayed, defeated, and forsaken by his beloved father, retreated into the warp and pledged himself to Tzeentch. The Thousand Sons had never planned to join Horus, but the trap that the Changer of Ways had laid for the Red Sorcerer's Legion led them to the Warmaster's side regardless. Meanwhile, the catastrophe on Terra forced the Emperor to deal with a new crisis that consumed most of his attention. He led the Custodes and Sisters of Silence to deal with this, while he left management of the rebellion to Malcador and Rogel Doran. Open Rebellion. Battle of Istvan III. The first sign that Horus and his legion had turned to chaos was made evident when Horus Virus bombed the rebel world of Istvan III. The planetary governor of Istvan III had declared his independence from the Imperium, and the Council of Terra charged Horus with retaking that world. This order merely furthered Horus's plans. Although the 4 legions under his direct command had turned traitor, there were still some loyalist elements within the Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, and Death Guard. Many of these were Terran Space Marines who had been recruited before being reunited with their Primarchs. Horus, under the guise of his orders, amassed his troops in the Istvan system. Horus had a plan by which he would destroy all loyalist elements of the legions at his command. After a lengthy bombardment, Horus dispatched all loyalist marines down to the planet, ostensibly to bringing it back into the Imperium. However, at the moment of victory, the loyalist marines were betrayed. With a cold snarl of "Let the galaxy burn," Horus ordered his ships to open fire on Istvan III, and virus bombs began to rain down on the planet. However, some marines loyal to the Emperor had remained on board their ships, and as Istvan III died, these soldiers fought desperately to warn their brethren on the surface. Their sacrifice saved many marines, as they were able to take shelter before the virus bombs struck. The population of Istvan III received no such protection. 12 billion people died almost immediately. The psychic shock of so many simultaneous deaths shrieked through the warp, alerting the Emperor that something was terribly wrong and informing the Chaos Gods that Horus was now theirs. A contingent of loyalists led by Captain Goro of the Death Guard escaped the fleet orbiting Istvan III aboard the damaged Eisenstein, fleeing to Terra to warn the Emperor. Angron, realizing that the virus bombs had not been fully effective against the loyalist marines, flew into a rage and hurled himself at the planet with 50 companies of World Eaters. Horus was furious at Angron for delaying his plans, yet reluctantly reinforced him with troops from the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's Children. On Istvan III, the remaining loyalists under the command of Saul Tarvitz fought bravely against their own traitorous battle brothers, but their cause was doomed. Soon, only a few hundred of them remained. Until finally, Horus grew unable to tolerate the delay, forced Angron to withdraw his forces, and ordered a systematic orbital bombardment that killed Istvan III's last brave survivors. Flight of the Eisenstein. The 70 loyalists led by Captain Goro commandeered the Imperial frigate, Eisenstein, and evading the forces of Horus, were able to escape from the Istvan system into the Immaterium. The Eisenstein was badly damaged during its escape from Istvan III, all its astropaths were dead and its lone navigator was mortally wounded. However, Goro managed to attract the attention of passing loyalist ships by setting the vessel's warp engines to self-destruct and ejecting them from the ship. Rogel Doran's Imperial Fist's Legion had been becalmed in the warp with its fleet for some time, and his navigators sensed the detonation of the Eisenstein's warp drives. Making an immediate course for the location of the ship's beacon, Doran met with Goro, who explained to him all that had happened with the traitor legions. The remaining crew of the Eisenstein, now aboard Primarch Doran's fortress monastery Phalanx, was able to reach Terra, after Doran's fleet destroyed the Eisenstein to ensure no Chaos taint remained, allowing the loyal Marines to report the extent of the atrocities that had occurred in the Istvan system. It was said in later millennia that without this warning, the Imperium would have faced even greater difficulties in responding to Horus's next moves. Although, his warning may have enabled Horus to enact the drop site massacre. The fate of these 70 Marines is ultimately unknown. Some believe they continued to fight for the Emperor until death claimed them, while others maintain that they were treated as if they were their traitorous brethren, either imprisoned and left to rot or executed. Others believe that Captain Goro, shocked by the terrible betrayal, became an apothecary, vowing never to kill again. Others believe some of these men formed the nucleus of the elite Space Marines chapter later known as the Grey Knights, for Malcador the Sigillite had presented 8 of the survivors to the Emperor before his departure. These men were gifted psychers, came from the ranks of the legions that had turned traitor, and yet maintained both an unbreakable faith in the Emperor and talent for resisting the temptations of chaos. Schism of Mars, 005-006.M31. On Mars, the Warmaster's allies, the Dark Mechanicum, led by the Fabricator General, Kel-Bahal, begin the Schism of Mars with the unleashed of a Chaos scrap code, from the Forbidden Vaults of Moravec, against the different forges of the planet. With this action, the civil war of the Adeptus Mechanicus begins. The damage of the scrap code causes the devastation of the majority of the installations and disrupts the planet's communications. Within the confusion, the Dark Mechanicum begins the conquest of the planet. However, they discovered that some forges remain relatively intact due to his more advanced security system. The traitor forces begin the assault against the pockets of resistance with the immediate siege of one of these forges, led by Epluvian Maximal. Overwhelmed after resisting for some time, the Tech Priest detonated the reactors of his own forge to deny the victory of the traitors. In a brief time, all Mars became a bloody battlefield where the devastation of the battles caused great damage to the industrial infrastructure and the repository of knowledge of the planet. Another of the main forges that resisted the scrap code's attack was the Magma City, led by Coriel Zeth, a loyal member of the Mechanicum. Kel-Bahal, to justify his attack against the forge, declares Coriel a heretic for her denial of the machine god cult. After resisting the first attacks, she was overwhelmed by the traitors and, like Maximal, she decided to detonate her own forge to deny its use by the traitors. After these combats, the loyal forces were reinforced with 4 companies of the Imperial Fists Legion and Imperial Army Auxilia, led by Captains Sigismund and Cambadias. However, due to the great numbers of the Dark Mechanicum forces, it was impossible to turn the tide of the battle. After acknowledging the situation, Sigismund ordered the loyal forces to take all possible munitions, armors and equipment with them before evacuating the remaining loyal forces from the planet. The conquest of Mars by the Warmaster's allies was a devastating loss for the loyalist forces. Nevertheless, Rogel Doran, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, orders a blockade of the planet to contain the traitors. The blockade would resist until the arrival of the Warmaster's forces for the siege of Terra in 014.M31. Drop Site Massacre, 006.M31. After ridding himself of all suspected loyalist members within the 3 legions under his direct command, Horus chose Istvan V as his command post and prepared a trap for his former brothers and their legions. Agonizing over the betrayal of his most beloved son, the Emperor ordered the deployment of 7 full Space Marine legions against him. Their orders were to take Horus and the Primarchs allied with him into custody and bring them back to Terra to explain their actions. Unbeknownst to the Emperor, 4 of the Primarchs and their legions chosen for this task had already turned against him, forming a 5th column which would strike against the Loyalists at the most decisive moment. The initial naval operation seemed to go well for the Loyalists. The Imperial Navy gained orbit over Istvan V and the legions proceeded with their planetary deployment. Under the overall command of Ferrus Manus, 3 whole legions took part in the first wave of landings, the Salamanders led by Vulcan, the Raven Guard under Corax, and Manus's own Iron Hands. Horus had foreknowledge of the location of the Loyalist drop site, and his forces mauled the legions during their landings, keeping them pinned down and unable to advance. Ferrus Manus engaged Fulgrim in personal combat, only to die at his hands while the Emperor's children butchered the Iron Hands. The Loyalists retreated towards the apparent safety of their brothers in the second wave, hoping to gain reinforcement. What happened next took them completely by surprise. The 4 legions of the second wave, the Night Lords of Conrad Kurz, the Iron Warriors of Perturbo, the Word Bearers of Lorga, and the Alpha Legion of Alfarius, already seduced to the cause of Horus, opened fire on their unsuspecting brothers, slaughtering them wholesale. This orgy of carnage would later become widely known as the Istvan 5 Drop Site Massacre. A phrase attributed to the War Master himself can easily summarize the entire battle: when the traitor's hand strikes, it strikes with the strength of a legion. After the battle, Fulgrim presented the head of Ferrus Manus to Horus as a trophy. Only a small number of Loyalist Space Marines, bearing the gene seed of their fallen brothers and carrying the critically wounded Corax, managed to escape. They fled back to the Raven Guard's homeworld, Deliverance, to tend to their wounds and alert the Emperor. In a single stroke, Horus had crippled 3 legions, killed 1 Primarch in battle, left another severely wounded, and a third, Vulcan, who survived due to being a perpetual, was captured and imprisoned by his brother Conrad Kurz. It was disastrous news for the Emperor and the Imperium. The rebellion spreads. Invasion of Parmar 5, 6730006.M31. After the victory of the Drop Site Massacre, Horus orders his forces to capture the world of Parmar 5 for its strategic position. The world, laid on the northern edge of Segmentum Solar, was a staging area for expeditionary fleets during the Great Crusade, and its conquest was a first step of the War Master's campaign against Terra. The forces of the War Master consisted in elements of the Alpha Legion, Legio Furians, and Dark Mechanicum, launch an invasion of the planet. After an initial bloody combat, the traitors seized most of the planet with the conquest of the landing zone Secundus. However, the Loyalists' defenders, formed from the loyal 77th Grand Company of the Iron Warriors, Legio Griffonicus and Mechanicum forces, make a stubborn defense on the primary spaceport and take heavy losses to Legio Furians. The defense of the Loyalists lasts until the second attack of the Alpha Legion, who turns the tide of the battle and conquers the last bastion of the Loyalist, securing the planet for Horus. Manichaean War 006-008.M31. During the Manichaean War, Horus himself led forces to conquer the Coronid Deeps. Battle of Fall 007.M31. Following the news of the traitor victory at Istvan 5, Rogel Doran dispatched a large Imperial Fists Retribution fleet to bring them to heel. However, they were assailed by a large Iron Warriors fleet in the Fall system. At the first siege of Hydra Caudatus in approximately 007.M31, Perturbo led the Iron Warriors against the Imperial Fists. Furious Abyss and Battle of Calth 007.M31. During the developments at Prospero, Horus's rebellion would be further strengthened by Magnus the Red and his legion, the Thousand Sons, now servants of Tzeentch. With 9 legions and much of the Adeptus Mechanicus behind him, Horus quickly struck towards Terra after gaining the powers of the Emperor after the Battle of Molech. Meanwhile in Ultramar, the Word-Bearers under Lorga launched a devastating surprise attack against the Ultramarines as the gigantic battleship, Furious Abyss, attempted to attack Macragge. While the Ultramarines took grievous losses at Calth, the Furious Abyss was destroyed and the Legion survived. Rupert Guilliman would now have to contend with the Shadow Crusade of the Word-Bearers and World Eaters. To hold up the lion, Horus dispatched the Night Lords to rampage throughout the Imperium to draw the attention of his Dark Angels in the Thramas Crusade in 007-009.M31. Shadow Crusade and Crusade of Iron 007-009.M31. The Ultramarines were still reeling from their battle with the Word-Bearers at the Battle of Calth and currently facing the combined forces of Lorga and Angron in the Shadow Crusade. Meanwhile, Loyalist Titan legions launched a punitive counterattack in what became known as the Crusade of Iron. The Khan's decision 007.M31. To occupy the bulk of remaining Loyalist forces, Horus commanded the Alpha Legion to bog down the Space Wolves and to jam the communications of the White Scars, who were unaware of the heresy, fighting in a long campaign against the Orcs of the Kondak system. For this purpose, the Alpha Legion used a strange pylon, located on the Tenebrae 950 installation in the Optis system, to manipulate the warp and the communications of the 5th Legion. However, the plan failed when Omegan dispatched a small team, led by Sheet Ranko, to neutralize the device. This action let the White Scars recover their communications with the rest of the Imperium and discover the news of the heresy. The Mezoan campaign in 008.M31 saw Mechanicum and a hybrid of Alpha Legion and World Eaters forces clash over control of the vital Forge world of Mezoa. Battle of Molech 008.M31. Following the Battle of Dwell and a failed assassination attempt on Horus by Shadrach Medicine, the traitor War Master regained memory sealed by the Emperor regarding the world of Molech. Horus speculated that great power lay on Molech, and wished to claim it in order to usurp his father. In the subsequent battle, Horus gained access to a warp gate and gained radical new psychic abilities. Path of Heaven. Jagatai Khan and the White Scars Legion fought against Slaanesh demons on their way to Terra. After the discovery of the Dark Glass and the subsequent Battle of Katalis, the White Scars managed to return to Terra to defend the capital world with their force. The formation of Imperium Secundus 009-011.M31. Despite the traitor defeat on Calth, Erebus was successful in creating the Ruin Storm, which threw the Astronomicon into disarray and rendered navigation and communication difficult. The Blood Angels and Dark Angels under their respective Primarchs sought Terra, but were unable to navigate the Ruin Storm and instead locked onto the Pharos beacon, ending up in the realm of Ultramar instead. As a result, Rupert Guilliman feared the Imperium lost and created a second empire, Imperium Secundus, as a contingency with Sanguinius as its Imperator Regis and Lion L. Johnson as its Lord Protector. Early tests for Imperium Secundus came from both the Battle of Sothar and the unleashing of Conrad Kurz on Macragge. Perturbo invaded the world of Talan in 010-012.M31, beginning one of the largest armored conflicts in galactic history. Final phase 010-014.M31. The Solar War 010-014.M31. After years of bitter fighting, Horus and his forces finally arrived at Terra, capital of humanity. For several years previous, traitors had been wresting control of the Sol system from the Imperial fists in the Solar War. During these battles, the Alpha Legion struck at Pluto and Alpharius was seemingly killed by Rogel Doran. The dissolution of Imperium Secundus 011.M31. The Imperium Secundus was constantly undermined thanks to the political clashes between Guilliman and Lion L. Johnson, with Sanguinius proving unable to negotiate settlements between the two. Due to the visions of both Sanguinius and Conrad Kurz of the Emperor, it became apparent that he still lived and Terra still endured. This, along with the many disagreements between its ruling triumvirate, resulted in the dissolution of Imperium Secundus. Sanguinius, Rupert Guilliman, and Lion L. Johnson attempted to breach the Ruin Storm to reach Terra, but in the end only Sanguinius and the Blood Angels were successful. The Wolf Cull 012.M31. Shortly after the arrival of Sanguinius on Terra, Leman Russ left with the intent on confronting Horus himself. Thanks to runes planted by infiltrating Knights Errant during the Battle of Molech, the Space Wolves were able to track the location of the Vengeful Spirit, and Russ and Horus engaged one another in a duel as battle raged around them. Russ was badly wounded, but in turn, wounded Horus with the Spear of Russ, cleansing much of the corruption that had befallen the War Master since Molech. However, the battle cost the Space Wolves dearly, and they fled to Yarant with Russ in a comatose state. The Wolves narrowly avoided destruction at the hands of Sons of Horus' first captain, Ezekiel Arbadon, thanks to Korax and the Raven Guard. Battle of Beta Garman, 012-013.M31. Horus armies had by now finally arrived at the gates of the Sol system, and sought to move on to the Imperium throne world. However, to do this, they would first have to capture the strategically vital Beta Garman cluster. The resultant Battle of Beta Garman was one of the largest of the heresy, seeing massive casualties on both sides. Particularly hard hit were the Titan legions, which led to the battle being referred to as the Titan Death. However, in the end, Horus forces prevailed, despite the War Master himself falling to wounds inflicted at Trisolian by Leman Russ. The muster on Ullanor and Lorga's coup, 013.M31. After the titanic Battle of Beta Garman, Horus' fleet was within range of the Sol system and mustered their forces on Ullanor. Horus during this time was still suffering wounds inflicted by Russ at the Battle of Trisolian, and the traitor war effort would have fallen apart had it not been for Malagurst, who gave his life to restore the War Master. During the muster of the traitor Primarchs at Ullanor, Lorga revealed that he saw Horus as weak and doomed to fail and attempted to usurp him. However, Horus defeated the coup, and exiled Lorga from his sight. Alfarius apparently quit the traitor war effort after giving the War Master a detailed map of the Sol system defenses, but Horus still mustered Angron, Magnus, Perturabo, and Fulgrim to his side on Ullanor, as well as forces from the Night Lords and Word Bearers. The fall of the Death Guard, 013-014.M31. Meanwhile, Mutarion and the Death Guard were fully corrupted inside the warp by Nurgle thanks to sabotage by First Captain Callus Typhon. When they re-emerged from the warp in the Sol system, they had become a horrifying army of Plague Marines. The Siege of Terra, 014.M31. In 014.M31, the first day of Primus, Horus Armada at last arrived at the Sol system. During the final intense phase of the Solar War, the traitors captured the solar system from Loyalist forces despite the best efforts of Rogel Dorn to stall until the arrival of reinforcements from Rupert Gilliman and Lion L. Johnson. Once within range of Terra, Horus and his forces destroyed Luna's naval bases and within 30 days had destroyed the Terran system's defenses. Terra was bombarded and devastated. The corrupted Marines from the Sons of Horus, Death Guard, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, Iron Warriors, Thousand Sons, Word Bearers, and Night Lords eventually landed on Terra, experiencing heavy resistance from the defenders, which were led by the Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, and White Scars. Vast amounts of traitor Imperial army, Dark Mechanicum, Chaos Cultists, and demonic forces joined the traitorous Tarates in their assault on Terra. The Loyalists were outnumbered and the battle for Terra turned into a siege of the Imperial Palace. By the 55th day the rebels had reached the walls of the inner palace, but Sanguinius managed to hold the Eternity Gate despite a vicious assault led by the bloodthirster Kabanda. Eventually, a stalemate set in with not even the siegecraft of Perturabo and the Iron Warriors being able to break the tide. Horus, who had remained in orbit aboard his battle barge, was at that point warned that the Ultramarines and Dark Angels were returning to Terra and would arrive shortly. If this were to happen, Horus's advantage in numbers would be eliminated and he faced the prospect of attacks to his rear. In a final gambit, he deactivated the Void Shields protecting the Vengeful Spirit to lure the Emperor in a final battle that would decide the war. Leaving Malkador the Sigillite behind to maintain the Golden Throne, and thus the seal on the ruptured Imperial webway, the Emperor saw this opportunity and teleported to the War Master's flagship, Vengeful Spirit, with Sanguinius and Doran, Terminator armored marines of their legions, and a number of Custodes. The Emperor's forces were scattered through the ship upon arrival and forced to battle their way to find each other. Sanguinius found Horus first. Horus was at the height of his powers, augmented with the blessings of all four Chaos gods and the godlike powers he had acquired during the Battle of Molech, and Sanguinius was slain. Horus stood over the Primarch's body as the Emperor found him. After a long and grueling battle, the Emperor was successful in slaying Horus, but he himself was mortally wounded. The Emperor survived long enough to be transferred to the Golden Throne, with Malcador having sacrificed his own life to sustain the device in his absence. With Horus dead, first captain of the Sons of Horus, Ezekiel Abaddon, took command of the legion and retreated, causing a general rout among the traitor forces. The assault on Terra was broken, but at great cost. Aftermath. The Emperor's final command began the Great Scouring. Under the leadership of the remaining loyalist Primarchs, the forces loyal to Horus were hounded into the Eye of Terror and locations such as the Istvan system sterilized. All records and the remaining homeworlds of the traitor legions were destroyed. Inside the Eye, the remaining traitor Primarchs, now nearly all demon princes, became detached from the affairs of the Materium and let their children fend for themselves. Without the Primarchs, the traitor legions themselves engaged in a bitter civil war until Ezekiel Abaddon, assuming the epithet, the Despoiler, would become closest. The traitor legions would have to a unified leader and lead a number of Black Crusades into the Imperium in the millennia to come. With the Emperor now indisposed, Rupert Guilliman took the mantle of Lord Commander of the Imperium and worked his brothers to introduce sweeping reforms to prevent another major rebellion from occurring, most notably the implementation of the Codex Astartes and dividing the Imperial army into the Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy. Two agencies left behind by Malcador before his death, the Inquisition and Grey Knights, helped to maintain the new order and prevent new heresies. Over the course of the Great Scouring, all of the remaining loyalist Primarchs either went missing, were presumed killed, or in the case of Guilliman himself put into stasis to avoid death due to his mortal wounding by Fulgrim at the Sala. Ultimately, the Horus Heresy was instrumental for the 10,000-year decay that has since set into the Imperium. The Emperor's grand ambition, the Imperial Webway, was abandoned and chaos continued to plague humanity. The hope and reason of the imperial truth was gradually replaced by the repression and superstition of the imperial cult, which now worships the emperor, still kept alive upon the Golden Throne through the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, as a god. Technologies from the Great Crusade era were lost over time, and eventually even the heresy itself became the subject of myth to the citizens of the Imperium. Thank you for listening to this entry from the Warhammer 40,000 Lexicanum.